I spent years watching operators launch standard business clones, thinking that raw, brute force labor would somehow output outsized financial returns. We see this clearly when an individual launches another identical digital agency or software feature wrapper into an already saturated market. The structural error here is that you are trapped in a 1-to-n horizontal replication loop. When you execute a model that relies on horizontal replication, your system experiences severe kinetic attrition. Think of the system dynamic like 20 identical wooden water wheels jammed into the exact same narrow stream. Instead of generating clean power, they crash into one another, splashing water violently and completely draining the stream's kinetic power. Because your operational energy input is entirely consumed by this market-clearing friction, your profit margins are driven mathematically to zero. You cannot optimize an architecture where the underlying physics are designed to bleed bandwidth. To extract yourself from this horizontal loop, you must stop trying to compete within an existing operational layer. True leverage requires us to step back and conduct a cold, objective autopsy on the data driving our structural failures.
When we find ourselves locked in permanent warfare with market rivals, our natural instinct is to lower prices or extend working hours. I have watched founders exhaust their personal cognitive bandwidth, trying to build minor feature iterations just to survive another quarter. This tactical approach fails because perfect competition is a structural energy bleed. Without proprietary insulation, external market forces will consistently dissipate all localized capital. Visualize a massive iron furnace burning through tons of premium coal at maximum capacity. Because it lacks internal heat-trapping insulation, all that thermal energy instantly radiates away into the cold open air. The result of this systemic flaw is a completely frozen central crucible, rendering the system incapable of melting raw ore. You are running an identical configuration when you allow open market vectors to dictate your pricing power. This structural vulnerability leaves you with zero residual bandwidth for long-term architectural expansion. If we want to build an unshakable enterprise, we must pivot toward an entirely different architecture engineered for insulation.
We often fall into the trap of attempting to build a massive, broad-spectrum enterprise from day one, out of fear that a highly focused niche is too small to yield massive revenue. You see founders stretching their capital thin across multiple unfocused market segments, hoping volume will solve their underlying margin deficiency. To break this pattern, we must implement a specific architectural shift known as the zero-index monopolistic protocol. This protocol forces us to abandon horizontal replication and commit fully to a proprietary vertical integration step change. Think of this structural pivot like installing a heavy sliding steel isolation valve that seals off a high-pressure main transmission tube. By engaging this mechanical seal, you completely block out external turbulent backflow from the legacy market. This isolation creates a perfectly controlled, pressurized internal vacuum where you can engineer a system matrix with a 10x performance differential over the baseline node. When your internal node operation efficiency functions at this order of magnitude, you secure absolute pricing control over your domain. Real leverage is never achieved by expanding horizontally into spaces where you have no structural advantage. True dominance requires us to shrink our initial target vector down to a microscopic focal point until we establish an unbreakable lock.
I regularly witness early-stage operators scaling their operations prematurely, pouring burning capital into broad marketing campaigns aimed at massive, untargeted demographics. This premature acceleration burns through critical seed capital before the core engine has secured a real product-market lock. The correction requires strict adherence to systemic sequence optimization. We must hardlock a hyper-contained micronode
securing absolute niche dominance before moving a single millimeter outward. Visualize a heavy industrial drill bit, focusing thousands of pounds of hydraulic force onto a single microscopic point on a solid granite wall. Because the surface area of contact is minimized, the mechanical energy punches a flawless pilot hole straight through the baseline infrastructure. Only after this pilot hole is established can you expand outward using larger cutting teeth to trigger structural economies of scale. This sequence unlocks zero index expansion, allowing your localized footprint to capture adjacent vectors with minimal friction. Network effect compounding cannot occur if your initial system footprint is too diffuse to retain kinetic energy. Once you control the localized infrastructure, the systemic transition from a fragile node to an unshakable market pillar becomes entirely deterministic.
Society trains us to look outward,
Relying on macroeconomic trends, treating business as a randomized lottery, or waiting for favorable market shifts. When you treat enterprise building as an exercise in probability, you effectively abdicate structural ownership over your operational outcome. The Coulomb paradigm demands the total rejection of indefinite stochastic variables in favor of definite systemic engineering. You must assume total structural responsibility to design an unshakable internal operating system protected from external volatility. Think of this architecture like constructing a monolithic three-part load-bearing pillar. It anchors a deep-driven bedrock foundation pile to a reinforced carbon steel rebar core, wrapped tightly within a poured high-density concrete sheath. This physical configuration is engineered to withstand thousands of tons of seismic shear without shifting a single millimeter. This structural integrity is achieved only when your architecture is built entirely on proprietary secrets and immutable foundational physics. True wealth and enterprise longevity do not come from optimizing existing market metrics. We build lasting power by engineering an insulated, localized monopoly through vertical technological progress that fundamentally alters the infrastructure of our industry.